The judge ordered the dog removed, but it refused to budge, staring down a juror until she broke down sobbing in open court. What secret was buried deep enough to sway a verdict? And why did only the dog sense it? Interested in the story? Keep on watching and let me know where you are watching from. The sentence that never came. The courtroom was packed to its corners, every seat filled with tense bodies and sharp eyes, the air thick with judgment and the kind of silence that hums just before a storm. Ryan Knox sat motionless at the defense table, his hands bound in cuffs that reflected the overhead lights with a cruel glint. He didn't look at the crowd, didn't look at the cameras aimed like rifles from the gallery. He just stared straight ahead, jaw tight, chest unmoving, as if refusing to give the world the satisfaction of watching him break. Once a hero, now a headline. Once the soldier who carried wounded brothers from burning vehicles, now the cop accused of fabricating evidence and using unnecessary force during a takedown that ended in a man's death. He hadn't spoken since the verdict, hadn't blinked much either. He'd only kept his hand resting gently on the dark fur beside him. Shadow, the K9, who had served with him both overseas and on the streets back home. Shadow was more than a partner. He was the last living thing that hadn't turned away. The judge shuffled his papers. "We are here today to proceed with sentencing in the matter of E," but he stopped. He squinted over his glasses. "Bailiff, please remove the defendant's K9 from the courtroom." A ripple of murmurs followed. The bailiff approached, leash in hand. "Come on, Shadow." But the dog didn't move, didn't blink. He stayed seated at Knox's side, body rigid, eyes locked, not on the judge, not on the bailiff, but across the aisle, fixed on the front row of the jury box. The room began to shift in mood, energy tilting like a boat leaning just before capsizing. The judge frowned. "Remove the animal," he said again. The bailiff tugged gently. Still, Shadow refused. That's when Knox finally turned his head, following Shadow's line of sight. Juror number 7, a woman with short blonde hair, clasped hands, and eyes that now seemed too wide. Melanie Grant. She wasn't looking at the dog. She was trying not to look at all. But Shadow wouldn't release her. His stare was a tether she couldn't shake, and something inside her started to crack. First, a quiver of the lip, then a tremble of the shoulders. Her breath caught loud enough to be heard, and suddenly she reached for her chest as though something deep and hidden had just been yanked forward. Tears gathered without permission. Her eyes locked with the dog's, haunted, frightened, familiar. Shadow didn't bark, didn't growl, just stared. And in that stare, something unbearable moved to the surface. Melanie's hand rose slowly to her mouth. The gavel never struck. The sentence never came. Because before the judge could speak again, a voice broke the air. Fragile, cracking, human. "I need to say something," she whispered. And just like that, the courtroom turned. Not toward the bench, not toward the defendant, but toward the woman who couldn't take the dog's gaze anymore. Chapter 2. The dog wouldn't leave. The silence that followed her whisper wasn't empty. It pulsed. The kind of silence that sucks the air from your lungs and replaces it with something heavier. The bailiffs hesitated, unsure whether to act on instinct or command. One leaned toward the bench, his voice low but urgent, and the judge nodded, firm in tone but already fraying at the edges. "Remove the dog," he said again, louder now, trying to reassert control over a courtroom slipping from his grip. But Shadow didn't move. Not an inch. The leash tightened, pulled with a sharp snap of nylon, but the dog remained immovable, like his paws were fused to the floor. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply stared, locked on Melanie Grant with such force that the moment felt less like defiance and more like destiny folding back in on itself. She tried to look away, failed. Her hands gripped the edge of the wooden bench so hard her knuckles bleached white. her shoulders trembling beneath her blazer. She swallowed something, words, tears, a scream, and then her breathing changed. It came faster, shorter, as if the weight of the dog's gaze had unearthed a memory too painful to bear in silence. "Ma'am," a bailiff said, moving toward her gently, "are you all right?" She shook her head just once, tight and fast like a reflex. Shadow's tail didn't twitch. His body was still a sculpture of focus, a soldier back in the field with a target locked. Another tug on the leash, harder this time. He planted his paws wider, claws subtly scraping against the floor as he resisted the pull. Then came the sound. One sharp bark, deep, resonant, final. Not hostile, not loud, but undeniably commanding. The kind of sound that ended negotiations. The judge flinched. The courtroom collectively inhaled. Melanie flinched like she'd been struck, her hands shooting up to her mouth. "Stop!" She breathed, her voice brittle. But no one had touched her. The bailiffs backed off, uncertain now, eyes darting between the dog and the woman who looked like she was crumbling from the inside out. "Ms. Grant," the judge said, cautious now, "do you need a recess?" Her head shook again, eyes wide and rimmed red. "I shouldn't have—" she started, but stopped herself. A tear slipped down her cheek and her voice broke like thin glass. "I shouldn't have been on this jury." The gallery erupted in murmurs. Knox didn't move. Shadow didn't blink. The judge leaned forward, slow and deliberate. "Ms. Grant, what are you saying?" Melanie closed her eyes for a beat, then opened them and looked directly at Knox. Really looked at him, like seeing a ghost that had never truly gone away. "I knew him," she said, "before all of this, and I didn't tell anyone." It wasn't just the dog who refused to leave. It was the truth. And now, it had nowhere else to hide. The tear that broke the courtroom. For a single breathless moment, the entire courtroom froze, suspended in disbelief. All eyes locked onto juror number 7, Melanie Grant, as her carefully composed mask finally shattered. Her shoulders shook, her chin fell to her chest, and then, without warning, she broke. The kind of break that doesn't come from pressure alone, but from guilt, left too long in the dark. "I have to say something," she cried out, her voice cracking through the silence like a hammer to glass. I can't lie anymore." Gasps rippled through the gallery, muffled shouts rising like a wave crashing into the walls of the room. Reporters sprang up, cameras adjusting, pens scratching furiously across notepads. The judge slammed his gavel once, twice, shouting for order, but it did little to stem the rising tide of chaos. The prosecutor turned pale, frozen in mid-motion, as if someone had cut the strings that held his confidence upright. Melanie covered her face with both hands, her body curling inward like she was trying to disappear into herself. But the words kept coming, raw and desperate. "I knew him," she sobbed, motioning to Knox. "Not from the trial, from years ago, from Afghanistan." The courtroom's roar dulled to a murmur, attention narrowing to her alone. The judge leaned forward, his voice low but sharp. "Juror Grant, are you saying you had a prior relationship with the defendant that you failed to disclose during voir dire?" Melanie nodded, tears falling freely now. "Yes. I didn't think it would matter. I thought I could stay impartial. I thought I could separate it. But I couldn't. And I didn't." Her voice trembled but didn't stop. "It was Kandahar. I was a Red Cross nurse. There was a mortar strike. Everything went black. I woke up in the back of a transport vehicle with a man holding pressure to the side of my neck. It was Ryan Knox. He carried me through the smoke. He saved my life. And I didn't even know his name until months later. When I saw him again during selection, I told myself it was coincidence. I convinced myself I could be fair." Knox hadn't moved. His eyes, once dulled, now held something else. Pain, maybe, or recognition. But he said nothing. He just watched as Melanie unraveled the secret thread that had woven through the trial from the beginning. "I voted guilty," she whispered, almost to herself. "But I didn't believe it. Not really. I didn't know what else to do." Shadow remained still at Knox's side, but his gaze hadn't moved from Melanie the entire time. Not once. Like he had sensed the fracture before it formed, the truth beneath the verdict. The judge sat back slowly, the gavel resting in his open hand. And for the first time in the trial, no one spoke. No one moved. Because a single tear had broken the courtroom, and nothing would ever be the same again, a memory buried too deep. The silence inside the courtroom hung like fog, dense, unmoving, choking every breath. Melanie Grant's voice trembled through it, soft but sharp enough to pierce the room's thick stillness. "I didn't just know him," she said, her eyes fixed on the floor as if afraid that meeting Knox's gaze would break her in half. "He saved my life." The prosecutor jerked upright, half rising from his chair. "Your Honor, this is—" "Sit down," the judge snapped, his voice laced with a gravity that demanded obedience. The prosecutor froze, lowering himself back into his seat with the slow precision of a man realizing he'd just stepped into fire. Melanie inhaled shakily, blinking against the tears that refused to stop. "It was in Kandahar. I was stationed there as a Red Cross nurse. Just 3 weeks into my deployment, the air raid sirens didn't come soon enough. I was caught outside when the mortar started. There was screaming, dirt everywhere, and then nothing." Her voice wavered. "I woke up half buried under rubble, my leg pinned beneath part of a wall. Couldn't see, could barely breathe, but someone was there. He dug me out, wrapped a tourniquet around my thigh, hauled me on his back through the smoke and chaos like I weighed nothing." Slowly, her eyes lifted and landed on Knox. It was him. The courtroom held its breath. I never knew his name until weeks later. Someone at the base told me, but by then, he was gone. She paused, voice catching. I never forgot his face, or his dog. Her eyes flicked to Shadow, who lay quietly beside Knox now, head resting on his paws, his body no longer tense. The same dog, aged but unchanged. When jury selection started and I saw him again, I froze. I should have said something. I didn't. I was afraid I'd be removed, that I wouldn't be allowed to, I don't know, to be part of the justice I thought he deserved. "And yet you voted guilty," the judge said, more observation than accusation. Melanie nodded, shame washing over her in full force. "I told myself I could separate it, that it didn't matter. But the moment I signed that verdict form, I knew I'd betrayed the man who once dragged me through fire to safety." Shadow shifted, releasing a slow breath, his eyes no longer locked on her, as if satisfied now that the truth had surfaced. Knox said nothing. He didn't flinch, he didn't blink, but something in his shoulders softened, barely, but enough. The judge looked down at the bench, running a hand over his face. "This court needs a recess, now." He banged the gavel once. "We'll reconvene after review." As the room stirred, Shadow closed his eyes at last, because whatever storm had raged inside him had passed, and the memory buried too deep had finally come back into the light. The guilt that never let go. Melanie sat on the witness chair now, not because she had to, but because she asked to. The courtroom had thinned slightly after the judge called for recess, but the atmosphere was no less dense. Cameras had been pushed back, reporters told to hold their questions, but the silence that filled the room as Melanie spoke felt louder than anything else. Her hands gripped the armrests like she was trying to anchor herself in place, as if the very act of speaking might hurl her backward through time. "I thought I could separate it," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of too many nights spent convincing herself she could. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was chosen to do a job and I could do it right, even if I recognized him. Her eyes flicked toward Knox, who sat motionless, the chain still loosely draped over his lap, more symbolic now than real. "I thought I could be fair," she whispered, "but I wasn't." Her throat caught, and she wiped at her cheek before the tears could gather. The truth is, I never stopped seeing him. Not the man sitting here in a suit, but the soldier from that day. Covered in ash, blood on his shirt, dragging me through smoke, yelling over mortar fire. I see it every time I close my eyes. She paused, took a breath, but it only seemed to tighten her chest. And during deliberation, when we all sat in that little room arguing about who he was and what he did, I kept telling myself I couldn't let that memory sway me. But it did. Not the way I expected. I became afraid that if I showed bias, I'd ruin the trial, that I'd hurt the justice I thought I was protecting. So I said nothing. I let the others lead. I agreed. I said guilty when I wasn't sure. She broke again for a moment, the words tangled in regret. And then I saw the dog. Her gaze shifted slowly to Shadow, still lying at Knox's feet, still, perfectly still, like a monument that had outlasted war. It was his eyes. I remembered those eyes. I remembered them staring at me as I lay bleeding, and I remembered them again when I saw him in this courtroom. He didn't look away, not once. It was like he knew I was hiding something, knew I was lying to myself. Her voice cracked on the last word, and this time she didn't try to stop the tears. "I voted guilty," she said, quieter now, like a confession whispered to a priest. But the guilt didn't wait for the sentence. It started the second I stood from that table and left the room. It's been following me every minute since. The judge said nothing. Neither did the prosecutor. And Ryan Knox remained still, but the faintest flicker passed through his eyes, like the weight that had pressed against his chest for weeks had just shifted, not lifted, but moved. And Shadow, sensing it, let out a slow, quiet exhale. The jury recalled the judge's voice rang out, deliberate and firm. "This court will now recall the jury." The words fell like a stone into water, rippling through the courtroom with an undeniable gravity. One by one, the jurors filed back in, expressions taut with confusion. Discomfort etched into the corners of their eyes. The bailiff instructed them to sit, and as they did, an unease settled over the room, thick and palpable. Juror number 7, Melanie Grant, was already seated in the witness box, her eyes red but steady. The judge folded his hands over the bench, gaze sweeping across the jurors. "You have been recalled due to information that calls into question the impartiality of these proceedings. What happens next will be handled with care, but also with truth." There was a pause, long enough to feel uncomfortable. Ms. Grant has admitted to a prior connection with the defendant. She has also confessed to voting guilty under internal conflict and emotional strain. A few jurors exchanged glances. One looked down, another shifted in their seat. The judge continued. "In light of this, I now ask you, do any of you believe your judgment may have been affected?" Silence answered him first, the kind of silence that tastes like denial and fear. But then juror number 3, a man in his early 50s with glasses sliding down his nose, lifted his hand halfway. "She wasn't the only one feeling unsure," he said, voice hoarse. "I didn't know about their past, but during deliberations, I had doubts. The footage didn't sit right with me. And the testimony from that one officer, it felt coached. But I didn't say anything because everyone else seemed so certain." His words hit like a crack across glass. The illusion of unanimous certainty began to fracture. Juror number 6 followed. "I remember that too. When we were deliberating, I brought up the inconsistencies in the timeline, and someone told me it didn't matter because the defendant had a pattern. That word bothered me. I didn't think we had enough to call it a pattern. Murmurs rippled through the jury box now. The unity that had once seemed unshakable was collapsing in real time. Jurors trading looks that said what their mouths were just now catching up to. Juror number 9, quiet until now, spoke next. I changed my vote on the second round. I didn't feel good about it. I didn't want to be the holdout. It was pressure. The judge leaned back in his chair, jaw tightening, watching as the very foundation of the verdict he'd been poised to deliver days earlier began to crumble under its own weight. Ryan Knox hadn't moved. He sat quietly, eyes on the jurors, lips pressed together. But there was no satisfaction in his face. No triumph. Only the deep, measured gaze of a man who had been forced to watch strangers decide his life without knowing they were fighting battles of their own. And still, at his side, Shadow lay unmoved. Eyes half-lidded, body still, like the storm he'd sensed from the beginning was finally beginning to pass. The missing evidence. The courtroom, once consumed by silence and uncertainty, now pulsed with a growing urgency. Knox's lawyer, Marla Reyes, rose from her seat like a match catching fire. Her voice, controlled but burning with conviction, cut through the murmurs. Your Honor, in light of the jury's statements and the unrevealed relationship disclosed, the defense formally requests that this case be reopened for evidentiary review. The judge raised an eyebrow, wary but listening. What are you proposing, Ms. Reyes? She stepped forward, papers in hand, but her words were already ahead of them. There was body cam footage labeled as corrupted during discovery. The prosecution claimed it was incomplete, unplayable. We believed them. We had no choice. But after the developments in this courtroom, I had a digital forensic specialist review the data this morning. A segment was recovered. You need to see it. The prosecutor stammered in protest, but the judge silenced him with a single glare. Play it, he ordered. The screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. Grainy at first, lines running through the image, but then it cleared. Slowly, sharply, with a clarity that felt like truth sharpening its teeth. The timestamp matched the incident in question. The footage had been filmed just moments before the alleged assault. Knox's voice rang out in the audio, calm, firm. Sir, I need you to back up. You've been warned 3 times. Please don't make me escalate this. The suspect in the frame flailed, yelling, throwing debris, moving toward a woman shielding a child behind her. Knox stepped in between them, arms raised, not striking, not aggressive, but protecting. Then the camera tilted, catching a blur of fur darting across the frame. Shadow. The shepherd lunged forward, not at the suspect, but toward the child, yanking her away just before a shelf buckled and collapsed behind them. Gasps spread across the courtroom like sparks. The moment played again in slow motion. Knox never laid a hand on the man. His movements had been defensive, his words controlled. The aggression had come from the other side, from the very man who'd claimed to be a victim. Reyes hit pause. The screen froze on the frame where Shadow stood between the child and the debris, tail stiff, body braced like a wall. This, Reyes said, voice barely above a whisper now, was called corrupted. This was buried. The judge leaned back, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his expression unreadable but grave. The gallery murmured. Some reporters looked stunned. Even jurors who had once sat stiff with certainty now looked away, ashamed. The prosecutor's face was pale, sweat glistening at his temple. He didn't object. He couldn't, because there it was, clear as daylight, the moment they all missed, the moment they were never meant to see. Knox didn't speak. He didn't need to. He just rested a hand on Shadow's back, and the dog, eyes still watching the frozen frame on the screen, let out a soft, measured breath. The story they'd been told was unraveling. And finally, the real one had a voice, said down. The prosecutor's collapse. The air in the courtroom had shifted into something unrecognizable, thicker than tension, more suffocating than silence. After the footage played, no one moved. No one dared. It was as though the truth had walked in and demanded everyone sit still while it rearranged the furniture. The judge stared at the prosecutor with a gaze that could have carved stone. Mr. Detmer, he said, voice low but edged with steel. You claim the footage in question was corrupted. Would you care to explain how it is now fully intact? The prosecutor, Richard Detmer, cleared his throat, but the sound betrayed him. It was dry, cracked, desperate. He stood slowly, smoothing the front of his jacket like it could straighten his unraveling credibility. Your Honor, he began, at the time, our technical team flagged the file as partially unreadable, given our caseload and the overwhelming evidence already presented. Overwhelming, the judge cut in, or convenient. Detmer blinked, caught off guard. The courtroom didn't breathe. He looked at the jurors, at the gallery, then back to the judge. His voice dipped lower, not in confidence, but in resignation. We moved too fast, he said, barely audible. We didn't look deeper into it. That's true. Knox's lawyer, Reyes, didn't let up. Moved too fast? Or ignored it on purpose? She stepped forward, holding a printed email. Because we subpoenaed your office's internal correspondence this morning. And what we found wasn't incompetence. It was intention. She handed the paper to the clerk, who passed it to the judge. The room waited as the judge read. His eyes darkened as he reached the final line. This email, he said, voice even but laced with fury, was sent from one of your assistant DAs. It reads, and I quote, "We need to get Knox off the streets. He's going to blow up half our cases with his mouth. Find a way." Gasps exploded across the gallery. One juror muttered, "My God." Detmer's face lost all color. I didn't write that, he said. But you let it guide the trial, Reyes countered. You let political fear bury a man who spent his life protecting this country and this city. You dismissed truth because it was inconvenient. The judge slammed his gavel once hard enough to echo. This court will recess until I determine the appropriate motion for misconduct. Mr. Detmer, you are to remain available for inquiry. Do not leave this building. Detmer sank back into his chair, trembling. He didn't look at Knox. He couldn't. And Knox, even in the eye of vindication, didn't gloat. He sat steady, hand still on Shadow's back, the dog's breath calm and even, because the storm they had weathered wasn't just about false evidence or manipulated footage. It was about fear, about truth being too loud in a room built to keep secrets. And now, the walls were cracking. The verdict reversed. The courtroom doors opened with a slow, deliberate creak, but no one stirred. Everyone was already standing, already watching, already bracing themselves for the moment that had become too heavy to carry. Judge Elkin stepped back up to the bench, his face grim but resolute, a man who had seen the truth bend and snap, and now had no choice but to try to bend it back. His voice didn't need volume, it only needed weight. And it had it. After reviewing the suppressed evidence, evaluating the testimonies, and considering the egregious misconduct by the prosecution's office, this court has no choice but to declare the original verdict null and void. A pulse ran through the courtroom. Shock, relief, justice all tangled together. Some gasped, others whispered. But one word rose above the noise like a wave, pulling everything into its current. Dismissed. The charges, the weight, the lie, gone. Mr. Knox, the judge said, eyes locking on him now, not as a defendant, not as an accused, but as a man. You are free to go. Cameras clicked like a firing squad, reporters spilling into the aisle despite the judge's gavel pounding once more. But Knox didn't move. Not at first. The chains had been removed hours ago, but now, in this moment of freedom, he reached down slowly, deliberately, and unclipped Shadow's harness. The courtroom didn't matter. The cameras didn't matter. The headlines were already writing themselves. But Ryan Knox wasn't thinking about any of it. He was thinking about the dog who never left, the one who stared down a lie and refused to blink. He dropped to one knee beside Shadow, his hand pressing against the shepherd's side. Then with a slow breath, he leaned forward, pressing his forehead gently against the dog's. No words, no speech, just silence that said everything. Shadow's eyes closed for a second, his tail giving one slow wag. The room around them buzzed with noise and chaos. But inside that small, quiet moment, nothing else existed. Melanie Grant sat still in the jury box, tears streaking silently down her face. She didn't try to stop them, didn't ask for forgiveness. She knew better. She stood as the rest of the jurors filed out, her hands trembling, her heart heavier than when she had first walked in. As she reached the door, she turned back once, eyes finding Knox and the dog beside him. No words passed between them, just a glance, enough to carry the weight of guilt, enough to understand that some things, once broken, stay broken. Outside, the sun had begun to break through the clouds for the first time in days, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions, waving microphones. But Ryan Knox said nothing. He walked past them, Shadow at his side, the leash hanging loose, not from disobedience, but from trust. And for the first time in what felt like forever, each step forward didn't feel like survival. It felt like truth, finally walking free. Chapter 10. The dog who saw her truth. The room smelled like old paper and clean soap, the walls painted in soft greens and blues meant to calm. A quiet hum of laughter echoed down the hallway as Ryan Knox stepped into the main room of the Veterans Outreach Center, Shadow padding silently at his side. Children sat in a half circle, legs crossed, eyes wide, their attention drawn not to the man with the scar on his chin and the quiet eyes, but to the dog who walked like he belonged everywhere he went. Shadow moved slowly between them, pausing every so often as a small hand reached out to brush against his fur. He didn't flinch. He didn't hurry. He just moved with the patience of something that had seen too much and chose, now, to give peace instead of warning. Knox stood near the wall, watching quietly, hands in his pockets. A counselor gave him a nod of thanks from across the room. Shadow had only been part of the K9 therapy program for 3 weeks, but his impact already rippled through the place like warm water. Veterans who hadn't spoken in months now waited in line just to sit beside him. Children who once trembled at every noise now smiled when he entered the room. Healing came in unexpected shapes. One boy, maybe 9, with bright eyes and a missing front tooth, looked up at Knox as Shadow settled beside him. "Is it true?" he asked, voice just above a whisper. "Is it true he stared at a lady till she cried?" Knox didn't answer right away. He looked down at the boy, then over to Shadow, who blinked slowly, his body relaxed, tail tapping against the floor once, twice. "He didn't make her cry," Knox said softly, crouching down to the boy's level. He reminded her she still had a soul. Sometimes, people bury things too deep. Shadow just knows how to bring them back. The boy nodded like he understood more than most adults ever would, then gently leaned his head against Shadow's shoulder. Knox let the moment breathe, then stood again, stepping outside as the sun began to dip behind the buildings. Across the street, the courthouse loomed in the distance, its columns tall, proud, and weathered. Tourists gathered near the steps, some pointing, some reading aloud from a bronze plaque newly mounted beside the main entrance. A photo was etched into it, Shadow seated calmly in the courtroom, his eyes locked on something beyond the frame. The inscription read simply, "He didn't bark, He didn't move. He just knew. Knox stood for a moment longer, one hand resting on the old scar near his collarbone, the other brushing along the line of his jacket. Behind him, Shadow stepped out into the fading light. His shadow, stretching long on the pavement. They didn't need the plaque to remember. They carried the truth with them. In quiet footsteps, in knowing eyes, in the stillness between judgment and grace,